All right, welcome back. Here we are. We are going to talk about a fellow known as Faust. And Faust is a fictional character who fits very much into this mold here. He may be one of the most important examples of this sort of rebellious, romantic hero of the individual. So he is from a German novel, but there are sort of myths, stories, and novels that kind of represent something kind of like him previously. There was, in fact, in Shakespeare's time, there was the tragic history of Dr. Faustus. And so Faust's story is Faust is sort of a scientist, sort of a scholar, and he is a demon summoner. So this was an idea that people had about demons is that, yeah, sure, demons are bad, but they might be able to give you secret knowledge. Demons, they could travel all over the world and, do all sorts of magical things. So they could, A, maybe give you magic powers, and B, and maybe more important to people in this time period, give you secret knowledge of things that had happened, things that they had seen, things that they knew. And so that's why you might make a deal with the devil, right? Is for something that you can't get any other way. And in many cases, this is knowledge. Goethe was a writer who, Goethe was a writer who wrote this story of Faust, and it became a very popular novel. And some people were kind of concerned about it because it is about summoning demons. But ultimately, it is critical of this guy, Faust. So Faust's story is that he was studying magic because he was trying to learn about demons because he wanted to get more and more secret knowledge. And he eventually ended up with a demon known as Mephistopheles. Mephistopheles. And Mephistopheles is kind of strongly implied to basically just be the devil, be Satan. And God and Satan actually have a bet on whether Faust will go to heaven. Satan thinks that he can get Faust to go to hell. And God thinks that no, Faust is going to win and going to go to heaven in the end, which is a theme kind of drawn from the book of Job, this sort of classic, um, this classic sort of biblical text about God, where the God and the devil bet on, whether someone's suffering will make him stop believing in God. And so Mephistopheles is able to offer Faust all these things that he agrees to. And Satan or Mephistopheles kind of leads Faust on this journey of fun and adventure. He gets to meet Helen of Troy from Greek mythology, who is the most beautiful woman in the world. And Satan in general introduces him to all this sort of luxury and all this beauty, and just sort of gives him whatever he wants, all the pleasures of life, which are exactly the sort of things that tempt people, as well as, secret knowledge. But ultimately, Faust begins to experience consequences. Like, for instance, because of his actions, his lover, Gretchen, kills herself. Faust also visits hell and goes on a journey from hell. That's where people like Helen of Troy are. And so this is part of his sort of education at Satan's hands. But ultimately, God is proven right. Faust decides to work to help humanity. He's been lacking a purpose in his whole life, and so he's been trying to, just learn all these things, but it hasn't been enough for him. But he finds a way. He has a realization that he can have a purpose, and this is to help humanity through his knowledge. And so ultimately, Mephistopheles is defeated, and God is proven right, and Faust goes to heaven. So it's a happy ending. Apparently, other versions of the Faust story weren't a happy ending. But you can see how this kind of explores the themes of, is knowledge a deal with the devil? Is there something heroic in knowledge, or is there something demonic in knowledge? And ultimately ends up at the place where you'd want to end up, which is like, figuring out what's good and what's bad. And it's quite an interesting story. And it's a play, actually, and maybe based on some earlier plays about a character like this. But probably at this point the most influential, considered one of the sort of great works of romantic literature. Okay, moving away from the sort of heroes of literature and fiction, although we will go back to them in a second. I want to talk about the heroes and some different movements that are going on. Because we've talked about romantics as folks who might be more predisposed to fight injustice and things like that. But they're not the only movement in town. We also have the abolitionists. So, as you may have heard, in America especially, where slavery was still rampant, even though no new slaves were being imported, it was still considered a major part of the economic culture of the South of the United States. And so they didn't want to give it up. Even after places like Britain had been willing to give it up, had seen it as a moral injustice and been willing to come to that decision. So there was a movement in the United States to fight against that, to fight for Black freedom and to fight against injustice. One of the sort of landmarks of this, and you may have heard of this, was Uncle Tom's Cabin. Now today, Uncle Tom has a negative connotation, in meaning a Black person who is sort of too willing to work for white people or do what white people want, basically. But originally, Uncle Tom was kind of one of these heroic figures fighting for freedom. He was a character in a novel written by Harriet Beecher Stowe, who was admittedly a white person, but she was also an abolitionist, and it basically showed the horrors of slavery in a way that was very accessible to a lot of people. So people would read this novel and realize, a little bit more about the actual situation of slavery. So this helped the abolition movement grow and stirred up this sort of anti-slavery sentiment, which was really good in helping the cause to progress. Eventually, leads to the Civil War, because ultimately the South is not willing to compromise on this. But this was a notable landmark in the abolitionist movement. But there were many others. For instance, there were slave rebellions. That might be one question that comes to mind. Why didn't slaves try to rebel against their masters? They could, it was just very hard. There was a lot of things in their way to doing so, but it did happen a couple of times. One of them was a rebellion led by Nat Turner, where basically the slaves on this huge plantation killed the white people who were there and tried to escape. And the slave owners were terrified by this. It was a very limited success. It really didn't do too much, and ultimately those folks were executed. Or they just ran to the north. But ultimately, slave owners were like, oh no, this is terrifying, and they tightened their control, which is a bit rich because, their control was evil and awful. But then we also have the writings of Frederick Douglass. He was a brilliant, intelligent man who wrote about the indignity of slavery as a former slave who had achieved freedom. He wrote about the horrors of the slave experience, and his autobiography explained, what that story was like, what that experience was like to white people who maybe didn't get it up until then, and also, rallied other Black people around achieving freedom. Another one who I don't have mentioned here, but is interesting, is Olaudah Equiano, whose autobiography was also very influential in talking about his experiences. And I think a point for both of them is that they showed that there was something immoral in slavery. They really, instead of seeing slavery as a state which is undignified, they showed the state of being a slave owner as the undignified state, as the sort of ugly and awful state. One more abolitionist I want to mention is Sojourner Truth. She was one of the women in the anti-slavery movement, and she was actually quite eloquent. It's a shame because one of the most popular versions of her work rephrases what she said to make her sound more stereotypical, which is really weird. But that version was popular for a while. If you go back to the original, she is actually a very articulate woman. And so she wrote about how women and spoke and gave lectures about how women have the right and women have suffered and experienced things under slavery just as much as men have. And so women can be leaders and women can have this strong voice, and Black women can be these leaders. This is also a time period where some of the roots of modern music are coming into being. Because slaves create new music. It may be the American style of music, and their music will lead in all sorts of interesting directions, including gospel, blues, jazz, and rock. All of these have connections to the African American experience at some point or another, and kind of serve as ways of coping mechanisms to deal with slavery, or at least to get through the day by day horrors of slavery. So the abolitionists, they fit well into the romantic movement, although they are less, idealizing and more in touch with sort of practical realities. There's also a guy named John Brown who leads a rebellion, a white person who leads kind of a rebellion in this one town, Harper's Ferry. Very galvanizing for both abolitionists and anti-abolitionists to oppose them, that this rebellion is happening. Okay, now switching topics a bit. When we talk about the romantics, do we want to talk about romance itself? Well, it's interesting. How did this idea of romantic, how did this label get applied to the idea of love? Well, it seems like the romantics really tried to celebrate the passions. Being passionate about anything was really good. And so passionate love was very important to them. And being honest about it and not trying to hide away from it or see it as bad, that was super important to them. And so their ideas of passionate love, they could be both platonic and what we think of as romantic. They could, be seeking love relationships, but it could also be the passion that you have for your love for your best friend or something like that. That was part of the thinking too. They were very into sincerely caring about people and sincerely caring about great things in general and capturing these emotions. Now, the way that they did tend to write a lot of romances and stories of romance, and then these shaped how people thought of themselves. The great heroes were often, great lovers. They were the leading men of these stories were involved in all sorts of women. The women were part of their stories. And when I say that, you can kind of see how this is emphasizing more the men. And the way that men are depicted in these stories is kind of more dominated by a male perspective. So the men in these stories often come off as very courageous, very strong, bold, and intelligent. Whereas the women, they fall into a thing which is true in a lot of stories for a long, long time, which is that they are either the Madonna or the whore. They are either the Virgin Mary, where they are beautiful and perfect and pure, or they are some kind of seductress. They are Eve or Lilith or Helen of Troy or something like that. And in Faust, we see this very clearly. We say Helen of Troy, basically her ghost coming up from hell, and then we see Gretchen, the woman that he loves, is beautiful and perfect, but she kills herself. So this is kind of the image of women that's being seen here, and it's completely unfair because it doesn't allow women to be more complex than these two polarities, good women or bad women. But we see these characters. One of the most famous seductress type characters is Carmen from the opera of the same name. She is Spanish, which also, there's some more stereotyping for you there. But this opera is basically about this young man and this seductive woman. And so those are the kinds of ideas that play into notions of romantic love in the Romantic period. But in contrast to that, the Romantic period is also a time period where women's voices are coming out and authentically representing women's experiences in a way that's more nuanced and more complex than that. There are quite a few that are worth mentioning. There are, for instance, the Bronte sisters. They are three women who were all authors and all sisters. And some of the most notable works of literature are in there, including Jane Eyre and Wuthering Heights. Jane Eyre is about a young woman who, kind of tries to find herself. She becomes a governess. And she discovers this sort of mystery and darkness at the heart of the man that she's in love with, and has to deal with that. Then you have Wuthering Heights, which is about a very sort of Lord Byron tormented young man and the woman who loves him. Then, in these stories, women are not just stereotypes. They are able to kind of speak for themselves. And there's even some criticism of men in there in the way that women are treated by men, that these women respond to that, and they represent this authentic women's experience. Now, they weren't originally able to do that or it was hard because they originally had to write under male pseudonyms. They wrote under the name Bell instead of Bronte. And so, it was they could represent women's perspectives, but they couldn't be published as women. Later on, that did change. But originally, it was very hard for them to succeed. And also, if you were a woman author, you might be stereotyped and not seen as legit as the male authors. Another of the interesting figures who really represents women's experiences is Louisa May Alcott, who wrote Little Women in America. And these little women who just basically grow up and their experiences and who they are, they're represented very clearly and very individually. And that's Alcott writing her story and the story of her family and the difficulties and challenges of who she is able to be during that time period as a woman who was more educated than most people. And her family, her and her sisters were more educated, but they still faced a lot of challenges because they were women. Another notable women author is George Eliot. Now, I say George Eliot, that's the pseudonym that she was most famous by. And during this time period, she, it was possible to publish under a female name, but like I said, she didn't want to be stereotyped as a female author. So she wanted to sort of be respected for her work. So she wrote under the name George Eliot. And she is famous for realism and psychological insight, talking about characters and the deep details of their psychology. And realism is an aspect of all of these, trying to represent something authentic that maybe hadn't been represented in literature before. Real actual women's experiences rather than like stereotypical women's experiences had just been, underplayed and not very well understood. But now women are actually finding ways to do this. In part, this has a lot to do with women being educated, women being connected to opportunities to be published and stuff like that. And so Middlemarch is another one that goes along there. But this is sort of connected to this idea of realism, focusing on the everyday life and, the things that are neglected outside of the sort of grand heroic narratives. So you can have your big Prometheus heroes, but maybe the greatest hero of all is an ordinary woman. That's one thing you might think in this time period. There's also Jane Austen. She's known for quite a lot, including Pride and Prejudice. And, you might just think of Pride and Prejudice as a romantic story if you're not familiar with it. But one of the very interesting things about it is that this is the story of a woman who has the chance and is able to, fight for herself and fight for what she wants. And when the man who is interested in her doesn't respect her, she, basically has to persuade him to get a clue. She challenges him on some of his nonsense. And so this is the kind of hero that you would want to have, the kind of young woman protagonist who fights back a bit against men just assuming they can tell her what to do. And finally, I also want to mention George Sand. This is another author who wrote under a male pseudonym. And she really pushed the envelope. She wrote about wild and passionate love that was, maybe not in the confines of marriage, maybe not what people expected. This fits into the Renaissance theme of the passions and rejecting sort of the chilly seriousness of things, of the rational enlightenment. And focusing on emotions, but it's also pushing back against ideas of what women can and can't do in literature. So her work was kind of controversial, even when she was writing under a male name, to have these women who were, by some people's standards, out of control. And her characters kind of defy gender norms as well and kind of blur the lines. It's not quite, to the modern point of thinking about transgender stuff, but they kind of blur the lines between male and female in ways that are challenging to the way that people traditionally think about things. So, yeah, lots to think about here. Heroes and literature, and, we're moving more into literature at this point. So this is the Romantic period. It's got a lot going on. It's got movements that are leading sort of in the direction of increased justice and new ideas coming forth. But it can also be turned to kind of a dark side with the idea of the national hero. But I think maybe the greatest heroes might be the women writers and the abolitionists. And maybe also Lord Byron. We can throw him in there too. Okay. Next week I'll do one more check-in with you guys about romanticism, and we'll have one more chapter about it to discuss. So next week's discussion question might focus on both the stuff from this video and the next video. But I'll look forward to that. And in the meantime, don't forget about this week's quiz due by the end of the day on Friday. And until then, I will be jumping in and out of discussions. All right, take care.